Welcome to our first series of interviews with leaders in the field and the leaders in bilingual special education. As you know, the Bilingual Special Education blog has been around since 2005, and our mission has been to provide information for teachers and parents about the needs of English learners who are bilingual and who are struggling in schools. Today, I am excited to welcome Dr. Pat Landurand, who has been an advocate, faculty member, state leader, teacher of bilingual learners in the state of Massachusetts, and who is recognized as the mother of bilingual special education. So we are very excited to have her here today as our guest speaker. And we also have with us Dr. Maria Serpa, who is emeritus from Lesley University, and Sarah Nino, who is another one of our hosts here in the Bilingual Special Education blog, and who works for the Federation for Children in Massachusetts. So we're really excited again to be here and to just have a conversation about how do we support bilingual learners who are learning English in our schools today. In particular, we'll focus on what the history has been, what has changed, maybe what hasn't changed, and where we should be focusing our efforts, and some advice from those of you, our guest speakers who have been in the field for longer than 30 years and really are able to tell us where we're moving and what we need to be thinking about. So welcome, Pat. We're super excited that you're here today.
Good to be here.
So I know that you became involved in the field of bilingual education, but I don't know how that started. So why don't you tell us a little bit how that interest came about?
Okay. I originally was an elementary teacher, and then I took 5 years to stay home and be with my son and daughter. And then I wanted to re-enter the field. I ended up accepting a position as an ESL teacher in Milford Public Schools at the time. And I was assigned I think 14 Portuguese bilingual students, grades 6 through 8, and pretty much was told, do whatever you want. I mean, there wasn't any curriculum. We didn't have books. We didn't have a particular classroom, etc. I must have been on the job for only 2 weeks, and I realized that I had 2 of my students definitely had disabilities. I was aware of this because my son Michael had multiple disabilities, and so I had taken 1 or 2 courses in learning disabilities at that time. And so it was obvious to me that they had learning disabilities and even more than that. Also, it probably was just meant to be because I am originally from a bilingual home. Portuguese was my home language. We spoke it all the time. My grandmother didn't speak English. And my mom had a disability, she had muscular dystrophy. So my home was always a home where there was a physical disability present. And I remember children were afraid to come to my house because they were afraid if they saw a wheelchair or if they saw anything that represented a disability. So I was sensitized to that. I was also sensitized to the fact that at that time in my neighborhood, I was the only person who was from a Portuguese home. My other neighbors spoke English. So I was also sensitized to that when children would come to my house and my grandmother would be talking and they'd be kind of giggling. So culturally, linguistically, and particularly, and also in the area of special education, although I had not been educated in it, I had the experience of it. So when I did work in Milford, I was very concerned about these 2 young boys, particularly one child who came to me the first day of school in a little suit that didn't fit him and a white crisp shirt that came, the cuffs were showing, a little tie, and he carried an umbrella. And I remember as he was walking into the class, that other middle school children were laughing at him. They were teasing him and so on. The other Portuguese students immediately recognized that, and you could see in their eyes how upset they were. But he didn't get it. He really thought it was funny. He was laughing with them and so on. So it was obvious to me that this wasn't a cultural linguistic difference. This definitely was something else going on in his perception. So anyway, after about 4 or 5 weeks, I decided to make a referral for Jose. I was told by my special director at the time, special ed director, that no referrals would be accepted for any bilingual student until they were English speaking or minimally had spent 3 years in the transitional bilingual program.
That's so interesting that you say that, because I hear those comments in schools still today of the guidance to wait until they're a level 3 or they're speaking English, and that in the meantime we can't. And what our audience needs to hear is that is inaccurate.
Absolutely.
We could definitely refer a student at any point that we feel has a special education need and needs to be evaluated, and that referral can come from a teacher, an administrator, or a parent. So
absolutely, and that's important that you bring that out. At the time, I thought it was just this particular special ed director and his attitude. I was unaware that this was a more widespread belief. But my first impulse was to request a meeting with the bilingual director in Massachusetts. And also I requested a meeting with the commissioner of special ed in Massachusetts. So I took a day off from Milford, drove into Boston, my first experience at the State Department, and I had an appointment with each one of them. When I spoke to the bilingual director, he informed me in no uncertain terms that his department only dealt with bilingual, quote unquote, normal children. And if they had any handicap, they belonged to special ed. That afternoon, I met with the Associate Commissioner of Special Ed, and I won't mention names, and he informed me that special ed only dealt with English-speaking special ed students. Now, the logic made no sense. I accidentally walked by the Equal Educational Opportunity Department, and I didn't really know what that was about. So I decided to peek in, and I met a wonderful man, Dr. Charlie Glenn, who was involved in the field for years advocating for our students. And he allowed me in without an appointment. I discussed my dilemma. And he said to me, "You're absolutely right. These kids are falling through the cracks. According to Title VI, they have a right, for any referral, right for assessment, and so on and so forth." And I said, "Can you do anything about it?" And he basically said, "No, because either one of these people don't report to me. I'm on a line item with them. I can try to talk with them, but I don't really have the authority." But he said, "Why don't you go to the Massachusetts Association, the Massachusetts Bilingual Advisory Board that has been established. That's the place where you want to raise the issue." So I took another day off, and I found out when the meeting was going to be. I went to the meeting, and I spoke to the president at the time, and he said, "I'm really sorry, you can't just bring something on an agenda, without knowing it, so we really can't hear you." And I said, "I've already taken 2 days from my classroom, and I'm a teacher, and so on and so forth." He said, we need a subcommittee that addresses the issue for you even to raise this on the agenda. So my question at the time was, how can I raise it on an agenda if you don't know the issue and you don't have a subcommittee? So anyway, I did manage to just invade the meeting, because as people walked out, I shook my hand, I told everyone the issue, and I got a couple of people interested in that. So I was going to come back, and I was hoping they would set a subcommittee. In the meantime, the president of the advisory board said to me, why don't you go to the National Association of Bilingual Educators? They're having their conference here. It's one of the first conferences that's being hosted in Massachusetts, and raise the issue. Well, I'm taking time for this story because I think it's important and not just a story. And so I had no idea how that works, because teachers haven't been educated on how the system works, how the structure works, how to get change, how to advocate. So I paid for an entrance fee on my own. I went to the meeting, and I realized there was no way I was going to be able to say anything. I mean, there was a keynote speaker, there was workshops, and where do I even address this? So the director of bilingual education was the keynote speaker. And I have to tell you, I don't know what he was talking about, because I was so nervous that I wanted to make this message known that I never listened to anything he said. But what I did do is when they asked, does anyone have questions? I
There your hand
and I asked about bilingual special ed, irrelevant to anything that was being stated. But this leader was wonderful. He was very sensitive, and he thanked me. He said he had not really known much about it. He thought it was an important issue. And then he said, have you talked to your state bilingual director? Well, I didn't want to embarrass my director and say what he had said. And I didn't say anything. And he said, well, why don't you set up a meeting with him? And I'd be very interested to see what the outcome is. So I did go back and talk to the director. And subsequently, a subcommittee was formed through the Mass Advisory Council, and they decided to set up the position of a bilingual special ed project director. And at the time, they wanted someone with a doctorate in the field and of quite a few things. I had no intention of applying. I was ESL teacher in Milford, and subsequently, I was called and asked if I would apply, and I did get the position. So I'm saying this because to think of all the roadblocks that happened, and there still are many, many roadblocks, and I think that's why people get discouraged.
Yeah, I hear you. And if you're looking back, if I'm looking back at what you experienced so many years ago, I can imagine how unsettling it is to hear that. I think a lot of teachers are in the same position, right? So many teachers don't know how to navigate talking to the state. Probably many feel that they don't have access to meet with state people. And you were a real trailblazer for that. And I hope that people who are, and educators who are listening to this story really learn that, one, yes, you can go out and meet with your state legislatures, and you should be asking questions in conferences and really not give up, right? Because I feel like those of us in the field that continue to have this conversation is because we haven't given up. And all of us have our stories of how we got there. So like I also come from I'm a second language learner, so I come from a Spanish-speaking home. And, the drive for me was having children in my class who had similar challenges. So we know that those children are out there every day. And we know that it is a population that sits in the middle of these two worlds still today.
Yes.
And even though there are efforts to create role descriptions, they're still paralyzed into two silos. So it's really important to get that history. And Pat, what year, if you don't mind me asking, did you start that advocacy?
1975, when I accepted the position as the ESL teacher in Milford. It was 1975.
So 1975, so we have 25, 35, 45 years where we're experiencing very similar challenges.
Yeah.
But I think, there are things that have happened since. Then we'll get into those. So Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to jump in and ask some other questions.
Just listening and absorbing and being part of this conversation. And I just have to say that it's such an honor, because you are such a historical figure. In 1977, you made this educational history. You made history across the United States of America and within Massachusetts by being appointed the first bilingual special education director. That is a phenomenal feat.
Yeah.
And I think about the title of that and the need for that, and just how many states, including Massachusetts today, that is missing that. So I'm really curious to know that Massachusetts made this bold move. Massachusetts does like to be and is first in the nation for a lot of things.
Yes.
And so this is a very historical and monumental thing by appointing you into this role. And when you got there, you talked about, previously you just talked about some of the challenges you've experienced as an educator and as an advocate, knocking on doors,
Yeah.
knocking on doors and getting answers, or saying that you weren't getting answers. And so can you tell us a little bit about, once you stepped into that role and then you now had statewide access to different other districts and other educators, what were the prominent concerns that you found that you and perhaps the people that were supporting you, project staff, what did you discover? Were they similar?
Yeah, quite a bit. First of all, I mean, Massachusetts was the first state to have transitional bilingual ed. I think it was 1970 or 71. And the federal office modeled their program after Massachusetts. And Massachusetts, I believe, was the first state also in special ed. And the Office of Special Ed in Washington modeled this. So there was a time in Massachusetts where I was very, very proud, because the state was a pioneering state. And the Bilingual Special Education Project was certainly something new. The first thing, my assistant director, it was a small project, but the first thing we did is we visited all 43 communities where bilingual programs existed. And we interviewed and sat with the bilingual directors and the special ed directors. I later found out we were the only department that ever went out and visited all its clients, you know. But that was really eye-opening. And what I learned was, it was a reflection of what it was I was experiencing in Milford with my special ed director. I did learn that the special ed office felt that bilingual education was similar to special ed. They were both the same thing. They both had little classes. They both gave individual type of instruction. So the special ed directors did not feel in any way that if a student had a disability, they should just stay in the bilingual department. At least they could get services in their own language. And most of them, in fact, did not want to assess the students until they had enough English. The bilingual department directors, they were upset about this issue, and they felt their students should have a right to be referred and assessed and served. However, they were very worried about the fact that they didn't have native language services in the special ed department. So many of them became almost parents to their children, and the teachers, they said, we don't want to refer them. We will keep them. We will do a better job on our own. I did find throughout the United States, Massachusetts, there were 5 bilingual special ed teachers working in the field. Maria Serpa was a teacher in the field. Maria Portuundo was a teacher in the field, and 3 other people. But other than 5, they were the only 5 I found in 1977. Now, I also found there were a few districts like Cambridge, Framingham, Brockton, where they really were assessing in the language. They had some specialists in the field. They understood the importance of language for assessment and instruction, and there might have been a couple of others. But in general, I would say that there was no collaboration, no coordination. I asked both directors, what did they want from us? What did they want from the project? Well, one, they wanted guidelines on non-discriminatory assessment, because at this point we were still having IQ tests, even though California had banned them in the 70s. They were still doing norm reference tests. Kids were still getting labeled. So they wanted to know, how do we assess in a more fair manner? They wanted people who spoke the language and the culture to help them. And they did want training. They wanted training for their special ed teachers in bilingual bicultural issues. They wanted some training for bilingual teachers. So there was an openness to wanting some kind of in-service. As a result of that, there were a few things we did. I'm trying to think if there's any other bit. Oh, at the same time that I took office, the mass advocacy in Boston was, Judy Levinson was doing her doctorate, and she had a most exciting doctorate that became a bulldozer to the department. And that was, she was investigating the districts in Massachusetts that were in fact guilty of prima facie denial of services to our children, our ELL kids. And she also was indicting the State Department for not taking action, because we're supposed to be monitoring this. Well, the State Department turned it around and just accused the districts of not doing their job. And I had an opportunity to work with Mass Advocacy, my project, and the Equal Educational Opportunity. And we set up an amazing a tool to look at districts for prima facie denial of equal educational opportunity. And I was very proud of that document. It was fantastic. So we did do that. Another area that I really feel that should be happening in the state, it was so welcomed. We developed the Bilingual Special Ed Directory. And my staff went to hospitals, community agencies, churches, everywhere we could, and came up with a directory of bilingual people who had different professional skills and certifications. And some of them didn't have any particular one, except they were proficient in the language as interpret. They had it as far as interpreting went. And we put this directory together and gave this directory to every one of the 43 districts. Well, they were crazy about it. They kept it on their desks. They talked about it. We revised it the following year. And of course, the state was very worried about this because they didn't want to take ownership for the names of the people there. So we had to have a disclaimer saying you can reach these people, you can contract with them on your own. We cannot certify the job they're doing and so on. But the resource directory was something quite good. And we managed to do statewide regional training, district training with psychologists. They were very difficult to handle. And I must say, I'll never forget a first in-service training where I asked them not to think of any norm reference tests that they had ever given. And I gave them case studies and told them to come up with creative ideas on how to assess these students who spoke another language, another culture. And a group of my psychologists walked out on my training, and they were so angry and insulted that they were being asked to do this. But then there were some very creative ones who stayed and really worked with me throughout the 3 years of the project to really, I propelled the field. And some of them were monolingual special psychologists. They were not bilingual, but they really understood. So those are some of the things we managed to do with the BICEP project. The last one that's an important one, I'm talking too much, but once we had our state office, I thought it would be very exciting to go to Washington, to contact Washington and say, how can you help us? And what are you doing in bilingual special ed? Same thing happened. The office, we took a plane, my staff member and I, we got there, we made appointments. And again, the Office of Bilingual Ed didn't know anything of what I was talking about at kids with disabilities. The Office of Special Ed said, we don't deal with them. It was the same thing that happened in Massachusetts. But again, now having the State Department behind me, it was easier to advocate for them to do something. And I would say the BICEP project was successful in encouraging the Office of Special Ed and the Office of Bilingual Ed to allocate funds, particularly for this population, to support grants and ideas. And the Office of Special Ed had earmarked for the first time that they would fund 23 grants in this bilingual special ed area. So that was the first. So I think that was some of the accomplishments. It was pretty exciting.
It's just amazing to see how everyone can come together with this common vision. While you do have some naysayers, you have that sense of the advocacy continuum. Well, where am I on this that can move this work forward? For example, I myself might be a monolingual English speaker, but where am I in moving the work forward towards equity, right? So that not being the excuse, but being the reason for moving forward. Thank you.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Good point, Sarah. And it made me think about, you know, Pat, that even though you're talking about in the 70s, it did take until 2004 with the reauthorization of IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, to really bring into the law that we were not required to do the achievement discrepancy norm reference assessment process. So I know that you were, once again, a trailblazer in this area. You really led that.
It's interesting you said that, because I was so excited on what California was doing. And I thought Massachusetts, we were pretty advanced in many areas in special ed, but for 3 years, we tried to get the Department of Education and the Office of Special Education to really do some very heavy-handed policy in this area to stop the assessment of students with norm reference testing and so on, and they would not take the steps. They would not. So
well, and I think although IDEA did pass the option to not use them,
yes,
it's still an option. And I find that in many of the districts that we've been interacting with, that I have been interacting with in the last 16 years that I've been in Massachusetts, we still have the same experience of self-psychologists that don't want to move away from standardized norm reference tests like IQ and achievement tests. So this is just a reminder again that the law provides for options, and it guarantees that there's non-discriminatory assessment practices. And you really began that conversation by putting those questions to psychologists. It is not a new question. And in fact, you know, those of us who have continued to do teacher preparation continue to do so. And it made me remember when I came here in 2004 to Boston College, I was teaching the assessment class, and I did use non-reference tests. And today I actually don't, because I think we need to make a bolder statement. And I feel now like I'm much more excited about my bold move, because I know there were bold moves that you made moving us forward in that direction much earlier on. So this is not a new conversation. And in this area, I think we do need the field to move a little bit quicker. I know in the Bilingual Special Education certificate program that we have at LaSalle University, we really strive to get teachers to think of other ways, those creative ways of evaluating progress. And one of those is to, you know, to share how dynamic assessment is done, to highlight the impact that observation can have in different classes, to kind of know those moments where you do say, this is not a language difference or a cultural difference, this could really be a disability. And then, of course, looking at the idea of a true peer comparison, which is more of a newer term that Julie Sparsa-Brown has really brought into the field that I really like, because it allows us to kind of just put it in front of every teacher to say, you can't compare to the native English speaker, middle average kid. You need to compare to a student that has as many factors that relate to them as the student that you have in front of you having challenges. So I think we have moved in some areas, we haven't in others, but I think it takes a long time. Maria, would you like to ask a question now?
Yes, continuing on with personal preparation and your historical contribution to the field, I would like to mention that in fact you were the first person in the country that had a dean's grant to prepare college faculty, in fact, as a postdoctoral kind of work, and it would be very important for you to let our viewers understand how did you arrive at having to prepare faculty at a university level, and what you had to do during your journey as a State Department person moving to master's degrees and then to the First Dean's Grant. So would you share with us your journey in terms of this stage of your life that you continue to problem solve to really prepare teachers and prepare college faculty?
Wow. Okay. Where do I begin? I'll begin, and it was the last year of the BICEP project, where I worked with Cynthia Gillis, and who was in charge of the comprehensive system of personnel development for the state. And I encouraged her to work with me, and we wrote the first bilingual special ed master's program that was awarded to the state. And that particular program, we were coming from the State Department of Education, so we didn't have the colleges we wanted, but we wrote a request for proposal, and we disseminated it among all the special ed departments in Massachusetts. And we're fortunate to have 3 colleges, Bridgewater State College, Fitchburg State College, and Regis State College, win the awards. And they received funding to develop specialized courses. They each had funding to fund 20 teachers in their master's programs and so on. And so this was sort of the beginning of what was happening. I became quite excited about all this, and I taught a little bit at some of the Regis classes. And so I left the Bilingual Special Ed project because at that point I thought I did what needed to be done, and I wanted to get into staff development, and I went to Regis. And it was at Regis that I had the opportunity to write a master's program in moderate special needs with a concentration in applied linguistics and moderate special needs. And it was quite an exciting time. You worked with me in that program. I hired you to come out, and I had so many wonderful teachers, Laurie Van Loon. And what was happening is I kept on thinking, we really have wonderful special ed departments in Massachusetts. How can we get these faculty members and the talents they have involved in this field? And how do we get the deans committed to this area? And out of that, I wrote the Multicultural Institute for Change, which was a dean's grant. I'll mention I mention names because every journey isn't alone. There's always a partner. And there was a wonderful woman named Eva Patowska who was at my house at the time, and we began talking about it. And literally she said, let's put on a pot of coffee and let's do it. And we sat for hours and hours, and we didn't know where we were going to even get funding at the time. And we began generating the creative idea of the Multicultural Institute for Change. It involves 6 colleges in Massachusetts. We insisted that the dean be involved, and it involved 14 faculty members, and you were involved in that, so you know what that was like over a 3-year period. The success of the project was that we not only were we concerned about content in the monthly seminars, but we were committed to try to change attitudes, to have retreats, to bring people of different diverse backgrounds together as consultants with the faculty, to make sure these consultants were in the schools when a faculty member was trying to redesign their course. So we created a community of people, and each faculty member was it was part of their commitment to the project that they write their own individual, we said training plan, but growth plan over 3 years. And in that plan, they had not only obviously to change their courses, but they needed to do field placements. And faculty didn't want to do field placements. They did not want to go to an inner city preschool program. They didn't want to visit a bilingual classroom if they didn't speak the language. They didn't want to go to a social service agency, some of them. So part of their journey was to get outside academia to actually do this. And it changed many, many of their attitudes. The deans were responsible to working with the faculty and develop their own department plans. So I think there was a realism in the Institute that you had to do something. You just couldn't sit down and listen. And I grew because I learned a great deal. I was young and I didn't know a lot in many areas. I just pioneered blindly, but I learned through my errors, things I did that caused problems, but I grew.
This was absolutely a first, and I was very fortunate to be involved. I would like you to comment on what you did and put in place to support faculty in their journey in their own institutions, because they learned all this stuff and they went back and you did some very creative things to support them. Would you comment on that?
Well, one thing we wanted was that whatever content we were teaching, we wanted to make sure during the monthly institutes, we wanted to make sure that they could make changes in their own courses, in their own professional life. So we did hire some fantastic consultants. You were one of them. We had Eva Batowska, George, Teresa Perry. I can't remember all of them. Not Mala. I can't even remember all the names. But people who represented different languages, different cultures. Radha Jalan from India, who may not have had all the experience in special ed, but they had the experience of the diversity, and they were housed I think it was a day a week or 2 days, I don't remember the plan, but they were paid to be at the institutions and actually provide that support for faculty.
Wow. Wow.
Yes, and it was very interesting. One component of it was when faculty went back to their institutions, your Multicultural Institute for Change would provide for professional development of the faculty in the home institution to
that's true.
Them change.
Yeah.
And that was like very incredible because I was fortunate enough to be one of the people that came to Leslie to support them in this work. And all of a sudden at the end of the presentation, I'm approached and say, well, we have a position for a faculty who specializes in assessment. How about if you apply? And so it was really interesting. But the most important thing
That's
is
how you got to go to Leslie. I didn't even think about
I went to Leslie. Because I was working with you at Regis, and it was very interesting how I was not intending to leave, but they came and said, oh, yes. But the point here is, how do we have a model of professional development for faculty? Because we are all lifelong learners, no matter what area of education we are in. And being the first one, how creative you were to understand at the time, and as Gloria was saying, trailblazer, and say, well, when you go back to your institution and you want to bring change, having somebody from outside that is from the initiative that you have that comes into the university and it's open to all the faculty. I think it also was another component that made a huge difference, because not only they had their personal plans, but they are also promoting change within the institution with outside help from the Multicultural Institute for Change. And it was totally amazing to really witness how the discovery of how certain things made sense, but they had never thought of it before. And of course, people went through growing pains in terms of understanding, oh yes, cultural differences, linguistic differences. There was a growth process, but by the time I think was very important, by the time which was in the third year of the program, that you provided the support to different institutions, the home faculty in that institution were really ready to champion the change within their own institution beyond their personal commitment.
I felt that there was definitely success in changing not only knowledge of the faculty, but deep down attitudes and concepts about diversity.
Yes.
And it's scary at times because remember we did a retreat during a snowstorm at one of the convents, or I forget, a seminary, and we were all treading new waters, and some faculty were crying and some were upset and some were loving it. And I went to bed that night and I got a knock on the door, and I remember two wonderful faculty members, African-American faculty members, who said, you may not be aware of this, but one of your training teams represented an African-American male, PhD, who was married to a white, a white professor. And we were offended by that. And I had no understanding. And they said, and I said, I'm sorry, they said, you do cultural diversity and you did this during our retreat. And I said, well, I heard they did a great job with their training. I don't understand. And they said, well, there are so few African-American professional doctorates and men and so on. And there are a lot of wonderful, professional women, Black women who have doctorates. And we feel that many of our men or white women, in fact, go after Black professional men. And we as professional women kind of resent that. Now, whether that's right or wrong, it doesn't matter. There's no right or wrong in someone, posing what was honest. But I only say that because there were many things I did not understand, and that was one. So I came to understand their viewpoint on it. And after that, one thing I learned is before I decided to do whatever kind of institute I was going to do or weekend retreat, that I utilize my own people that were diverse. They were two diverse people of my 14 faculty members. And I should have talked to them about, what they wanted or so on. So I made some mistakes, and then I learned to be a better team member and also not assume that things were going to be the way my eyes saw them. So there were just a lot of very wonderful openings. One lovely Italian professor from, I won't say the college, she was Irish Italian or something, and she said, I'm going to quit because I don't feel I'm anything. I'm Italian, I'm Irish, I don't speak anything, I don't feel comfortable here, you've made me feel inadequate. And I thought, oh my goodness. And then I realized, she spoke that, but I had many monolingual English-speaking faculty in my institute. So we had to backtrack and talk about, how they needed to feel proud of who they were. And so, so there were lots of errors, but it's okay as long as people know you're being honest and you're trying to grow together, you can overcome that, So.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting you talk about those two particular issues at a time right now where we're dealing with a lot of work on equity, inclusion, and diversity, and where a lot of faculty at universities still feel very marginalized and microaggressed, and where a lot of the conversations continue to be very shallow in the way that they're done. And again, thinking about how many years ago is, it's a bit sad. But, there's new professionals. And I think that's the power of this conversation, is that we're going back historically to kind of know where we've been. And for those of us who don't have the history, it may feel like the first time. But for those of us who are learning about the history, to know that there are some roots there, that there are people who are open, and that we've learned lessons from doing these institutes, from doing these professional networks, from providing a lot of the training that you did in that time that you described. In fact, I was getting some ideas that I was jotting down. So I love that part of this conversation. And I hope those of you who are listening to us are getting some ideas of their own to make that change in their own buildings, in their own grade levels, in their own districts, or in their own states. So why don't we move to another question, Pat? In 1981, you were invited to be the keynote speaker for the first National Bilingual Special Education Conference, sponsored by the International Council for Exceptional Children. How exciting is that? And what, if you remember going back to preparing for that, what were some of those topics you addressed during that being the first keynote in this probably first time event for the largest professional organization of teachers who work with students with disabilities?
I must admit that I was so busy working all the time that I didn't realize what a big deal it was until my dean at Regis University was so excited and had me meet the president to tell her about it. And then I thought, wow, this is something, and I remember standing in front of so many people. And I wasn't nervous at all until I stood there and I thought, oh my goodness, it's a good thing I didn't know it was that important. But anyway, my topic was culturally responsive education. Where are we? Where are we going? And how do we get there? And I really felt it was an exciting platform to raise the issues and concerns around our population of ELL students with disabilities. I had a good foundation from the BICEP project. So I did have a lot of concrete examples and data and so on to really, I think, communicate clearly where our students were at educationally in public institutions. But I also was really excited because I felt we had accomplished something with bilingual special ed. So I could tell them about, the training or our directory or our prima facie tool. And another thing which I didn't mention, it took a great deal of work to get the Mass Department of Ed, Special Ed Department, when they went to audit the districts to address our issue. So our project put a tool together and made them make a commitment to but to have on the team some folks like us who could look at what was happening with the culturally and linguistically diverse student with disabilities. So that was another big thing. But the keynote was fun because not only could we talk about concerns, but I felt we could talk about some small accomplishments we had made. And then I felt courageous enough to make recommendations. So it wasn't nerve-wracking at all once I saw the journey.
So do you remember some of those recommendations?
Yeah, I did recommend the importance of districts working, the bilingual and the special ed department working together, the importance of cross meetings between the bilingual teachers and the special ed, because on in-service days, the bilingual teachers went to their little spot and the special ed teachers, went to theirs. I talked about the importance of how assessment was really, the norm reference assessment was killing these kids and how we had to do quite a bit of work in this area. And I was pushing for staff development. I also was a thorn on the side of the state departments because I was trying to address, the issues of their monitoring, their auditing, their CSPD training, all the areas where they could be in the forefront, and their responsibility to help districts access diverse resources, because you can't expect a district administrator to know where to find a Chinese social worker or where to find a Lebanese speech and language therapist, but the state should be doing it, and it was their responsibility. So those were some of the things that I remember saying, I think.
And I love those because I think today I would love for you to recommend those same exact things to our State Department, to our districts, and to our professional organizations. I mean, those are 4 areas that I continue to speak about as well, you know, inviting English learner teachers to the special education teams, providing them time to meet together to address multi-tier systems of support, and yeah, providing ways at the state level where they can access, you know, multilingual, you know, trained professionals who could come and, you know, navigate the challenge of culture and language as these kids are referred for special education services.
And
So
the parents, I did a lot. I think there was a great deal of recommendations of the state's role, not only translating documents, but really working in a culturally and linguistically relevant way with diverse parents to empower them. And that was really very important. And also to let the schools know that the parents were their educators. So not to look down on the parents, but find out the funds of knowledge that they could gain as a teacher or a director by working with the community and the parents. So
that fund of knowledge is so critical, Pat, because I do feel that there is so many assumptions today of why parents come or do not come to special education meetings, and we make a lot of poor decisions around those kind of assumptions without really seeing them as a fund of knowledge, like you say. One of the things that I've seen in my field since I became a teacher in 1993 is that I remember when I got trained to be a special educator, we had to collect an intensive parent intake interview where we looked at developmental milestones, language milestones, where we talked about the culture of the family and, you know, the siblings or no siblings and the expectations that the parents have for their child. And in many of the IEPs that I see today, as I do teacher preparation, that part is completely missing. And I think it's one of those parts that, you know, I love your recommendations because I think it brings us back to the essence of where we were in the 1970s when special education law came into place, and when critical legal policies were driven for English learners, bilingual learners. And, you know, for example, I don't think that a directory exists right now, right? Is each district has something, you know, of a list of schools, and there's no, you know, monthly project. So I think it's a lot of the same people who are trying to continue the conversation, and, you know, how can we think in the future how to help us to continue to grow that. And then I also think that aside from the home interviews, you know, one of the other things that has happened in the last 45 years is that we've taken the expertise of teachers away in many ways. And so I get a lot of teachers who say, please just tell me what to do. And really what we needed are teachers like you and like me and like Sarah and Maria, who went knocking on doors and weren't afraid, and, you know, and felt assured that what felt right for us professionally to help our students was important to bring to a conversation. And I think that's something that I hope our listeners are really taking from this conversation as well.
So well stated.
And that's a good point, Claudia. If you don't mind if I hop to the next question, because
Absolutely.
I think that's a good segue into this. So Claudia and I have been working a lot recently with the coalition that we're co-founding members of, called the Coalition for Equity, Diversity, and Disability. And one of the topics that we held an open house for, we opened this, it was a free open forum to exchange resources with practitioners, families, service providers, anyone out there that had questions about bilingual special education or how to support students, particularly during this COVID pandemic and during these conversations and actions that we need that are anti-racist and anti-language, anti-cultural. you know, conversations that we're having socially as a group. So when I think about this, and I think about a lot of people feel, where am I on that spectrum of advocacy? There's, where am I as a person where I can move this equity work forward? And a lot of educators are having these discussions as we prepare for summer, as we prepare for fall, you know, with the changing social dynamics and you know, health restrictions with COVID. And I go to that because a lot of people, like Claudia was saying, they're like, well, just tell me what to do. Just tell me what I need to do. And I go back to your previous example where you sat down with your friend, a cup of coffee or a pot of coffee, and you said, we have an issue.
Yeah.
What would we do to move this work forward? Not necessarily, let me email someone, let me do this. You went and you reflected on your own and you said, what would we need to move this work forward? And that brings me to funding, having the resources, having everything that you need to move the work forward. And you did something with your example by saying, we didn't focus on the funding at that point. We focused on what the needs were. And you said, I will work on the funding later. We'll find a grant, we'll find money, we'll try to find different creative ways. And so I just have to say that that's just a phenomenal way about creativity and going about collaborative solution seeking, right, in that process. And you yourself are the author of 11 funded 3-year personal development grants.
And I can remember, no.
to help move this work forward. And so finding those resources is also empowering for educators to think about. It's another aspect that I know myself I would like to work on. So can you share a little bit more about your time and energy that you spent finding those resources to move your work forward?
Well, I was certainly motivated, and I loved, I think one thing I love about grant writing is the creativity to just develop something, you know, from scratch. So that's really exciting. But being very practical, I don't think I would have been successful if I had not had the opportunity to just it was only a 2-day training on how to write grants. It was a how-to. And I got invited to Washington, D.C. through the Office of, I think it was Special Ed or Bilingual Ed, to participate. And I went, and the how-to was pretty easy. But most people don't know the how-tos. So if you have the burning need, you have the creativity, you have the ability to write, you still will not be very successful, especially with government grants, if you don't have the tools. So they gave me the gear to allow me to do that. And so federal funding became something I did, you know, I did, and the more you do it, the better you get at it, quite frankly. You get more disciplined in how you do it and so on. There are so many other sources of funding. I always wanted to, and I have not, because it's so much easier to do funding through foundation grants and private foundations, because you really just have to sell a couple of people. And, you know, you don't have to meet all these criteria and have all these committees judge you and compete against so many other grants. So I haven't done that, but I would urge people in this field to look at other avenues of funding. But basically, you know, I got a little experience in it, and then one thing builds on another. It's like exercise. You know, the first day you exercise 15 minutes, then you get better at it, you do it longer or more intense. So it's just experience, I guess.
Well, no, I appreciate you sharing that, because one of the things that we consistently see in the field, and then also too what we see from the research, is that we constantly see that there are our anti-discrimination laws related to special education, related to learning English, and we're still seeing that a lot of professionals and a lot of schools and districts are still struggling to even understand what those are. And so, you know, for example, there's still the thought that special education trumps language learning. there might be words saying, oh, I understand that they are equal, they are both civil rights, but you don't see that in service delivery, where you see students not receiving the services that they're entitled to. You see a lot of restrictions around, well, our IEPs can't include this because it's not a special education concern, that's a language concern.
Right.
When we're forgetting about the whole child that's in front of us, and what that child needs and the services that they need. And a lot of that is associated with personal development and developing their understanding, like Claudia was saying about norm reference or standardized assessments being the you know, above all way of and then also too with the school psychologist example that you gave, with people walking out of the room because they're not able to provide any type of tools, activities, materials, resources, strategies that are anything but something that's manufactured by a testing company, right? So I definitely see the historical impact you have with your personnel development grant writing, and how just being able to have the information that you need to be able to make educated, informed, and ethical decisions about our students is really important. So I really want to thank you for your leadership and for your trailblazingness. Is that a word? Trailblazing?
One comment I just thought of is one experience that I think folks who are who want to move this field forward is to be a field reader of grants. And because once you sit in and you read grants and you have to give points for their different sections, and you listen to the committees on why they decide to fund a particular grant or not fund a particular grant, is a wonderful experience. It's tedious to do it, but you get a lot in return on learning how to do it, how to write.
Yeah, that's great advice, Pat. I just finished going through a round of reviewing for OSEP about a week and a half ago, and you do learn so much, and you do get an opportunity to kind of see where the field is going, which is what I like about it, you know. This last round was called searching for proposals around coaching, and there were very in special education, and there was only, I mean, there were many submissions, so they had different teams, but in my team we reviewed 10 proposals, and only one was around English learners with disabilities. So it's interesting because you then move your thinking as to, if you're there reviewing, you can also ask the question. So in every one of those, I said, they didn't address this population, they didn't address this population. And so you learn how proposals are written. 2, you learn where the field is going. And 3 is you ask the questions that makes the field move in that direction.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, and what's interesting that has happened probably that you don't know about is, that before you had to get invited to go to those training meetings for writing the grants. And IES, the Institute for Education Sciences, right now has a whole YouTube channel and has those webinars now available. So any teacher, any school leader, any researcher could hop on and look at the proposal, how to write a proposal for federal funding. And it's now, through the use of technology, that is one area that it's moving. And then, the other idea that you had around foundations, it's really critical. That's where, I've been a little bit successful in getting funding for a slightly different approach, but of population. But there are many foundations in the state of Massachusetts, and banks like the Bank of America, the Cummings Foundation, and then there's other nationals like the Spencer Foundation, the Gates Foundation, who, with the use of maybe 1 to 3 to 5 pages, you might be able to get funding to begin. So, that's for our listeners, again, to kind of, get on the computer and Google those foundations and see which of them are funding your communities, and start as small as you can or as big as you imagine. The idea is to keep moving forward, right? And, Pat, you help the field move so vastly and so fast and so widely. But that doesn't mean that we can't have teachers that begin changing the way that their peers believe these students are capable, or move to create and move the world in ways that you did. Maria, did you want to address the next question?
Yes, I would like to move us to the building capacity issue that was so important in all the work that you have done. And I also would like to mention that the 11 grants that were funded, there were other attempts that you did, that you wrote, that were not funded. So people, our listeners, understand that it happens to all of us, that we put the work in and we do everything we can, and not all of them. But what's something that I learned from you that was so amazing is learn from the reviewers what they said that your grant needs, your proposal, and then go back and resubmit. So when we look at your work and how you did all the proposals to build capacity in bilingual special education, we know that you directed and taught in most of them. Is there one particular one that is very special to you? Because they all had a tremendous impact, but is there one that you would like to highlight to our listeners in terms of all the work that you did that is especially important to you at this point as you look at your professional journey?
Well, I think the Multicultural Institute for Change was definitely one. A second one, which had a great impact, was multi-system. And that's the systematic instructional planning for exceptional bilingual students that I wrote with Nancy Cloud at Teachers College. It was a little different than the other grants because it was more of a product, and it involved various components, and people could get invested in a level 2 training of 3 days, or take the entire multi-system training, which was 7 days, or become a trainer for a total of 12 days. And I liked the multi-system because we tried to streamline different areas of content that was necessary for monolingual special educators or bilingual special educators or bilingual teachers even to have in order to better serve our students. So we had one area which dealt with the foundations and the theories in working with culturally and linguistically diverse students. We had a second area that dealt with the designing of the culturally and linguistic. You always use different terms. For this grant, we use culturally diverse exceptional students. We had a section on specialized informal assessment techniques, and another session for working with parents and working with the community. So there were basically 4 sections. And around those sections, we devised very specific kinds of training. We were fortunate when we finished the 3-year grant to have the Council for Exceptional Children request that they be the disseminators and the organizers of the national training, because that gave us a lot more credibility. Plus, we didn't have the time or the know-how to do that. And you were one of the trainers. Nancy Cloud was another trainer, and I was. And I don't know, I keep on thinking there was a 4th person from California, and I can't believe it. I don't know. Maybe it was just the 3 of us. But anyway, it was very exciting to move this training throughout the United States to see what some of the issues were as far as, how the issues of the West versus the East versus the South, the Midwest, and also to be able to provide, through the CEC's organization, provide a trainer-trainer model. So we knew that these folks that were being trained could go out and at least provide people with this basic package of pretty solid content information. So I thought that was exciting for me. It was a different kind of grant.
It was very exciting to see how you took a risk, and you, as people say, think big. Not only you did that at the state level, but then you went to the national level in trying to solve, provide solutions for something that still is current today. And the impact that you had in terms of giving people the know-how to advance equity in assessment and in instruction of kids with disabilities who spoke a language than English at home. I have to say my tribute to you and my gratefulness for all you did, because you were the first one to think about this and the impact it had and how inspiring this is for all of us, and particularly to our listeners, no matter how old you are, and seeing every single person can absolutely do work that impacts children or students and their families who speak a language other than English, and not only to really advance equity. And of course, at the top of the list, we have our students with disabilities who speak a language than English at home, who at this point really need very dynamic professional development, short-term and long-term, to provide for this equity that we've been talking about. So I want to say thank you. I was very honored to speak with you and to work with you on this. It was very interesting how we went to different places around the country to teach assessment from the multi-system. It was very interesting to see the transition from the whole 5 days to the way CEC decided to provide this information to the field across the US. So this is an inspiration for all of us, no matter where we are, in the United States or outside the United States. We can all do something that moves the agenda of equity for everyone forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat, and Maria and Sarah. We're a little bit over an hour, so I think that we should take a break and just once again thank you for all the wisdom that you have brought us today, for all the ideas and recommendations and interest in getting us to continue with moving the field forward, to continue to fight for the rights and equity and education that students with and without disabilities who are multilingual deserve. And so I'm just going to ask you if you had any final thoughts today, and hopefully we'll get you back on at a different time and continue a couple other questions that we had for.
So many questions for you, Pat. So many questions.
I just would like to say one thing, and that I did spend 15 years at Rhode Island College. And I had been at Brown, and I had written grants again and directed their ESL program. And I chose to go to Rhode Island College because I had a personal need to work very intensely with the area I was interested in. And I enjoyed tremendously the work I did in a professional development school with one particular school, the Veterans Memorial School, and the work we did with teachers and parents and the community around serving the culturally and linguistically diverse student. And I also enjoyed the fact that we did the same multicultural inclusion project, the same multi-system, I mean, not multi-system, the college program at Regis. We were able to replicate that at Rhode Island College with their neighboring colleges and local people. And working with Nancy Cloud in the field of the master's program, we were able to actually certify more than 200 teachers who were credentialed in the field of ESL, bilingual special education. And what was interesting about that is we made a decision not to go after any federal funding, to just go after state support and state funding and local support from the districts and support from the college. And the negative is we didn't have a lot of money to bring in lots of consultants and really do the kinds of things we wanted, support travel. The good thing was people got really invested. It was the college's program. It was Rhode Island Department of Ed's program. It was Veterans Memorial School program. So there's something to say that you need both kinds. You need the federal kind of approach, but you also need the grassroots kind of approach. And it was just two different ways to try out the same thing.
Wow, that's amazing.
That's all.
Wonderful, wonderful. Pat, do you have any recommendations for educators who are entering the field now, who are concerned, who experience the same thing you experienced that first year with your Portuguese-speaking students, and what you would recommend now?
Although although the racism seems more blatant now, you know, when we look at the media and we look at our president and what's going on with our population, the deplorable kinds of actions, and I don't mind saying that publicly, I think this could frighten lots of teachers, but I do feel that the content and information is at a much more advanced level than it was in the 70s. And I feel the awareness of discrimination and racism the awareness is at a much higher level today because of all the terrible things we see than it was in the past. So I would say that in spite of being afraid to venture out, new teachers are in a much better position because of this. When you think of the 60s and you think of the civil rights movement and you think of all the violence that occurred, but look at all the wonderful things that occurred after that, you know, Title I and special ed laws and so on. So it's horrible what's happening right now, but I do feel that we can have some very latent positive consequences. And I would say, which I'm new to because I'm not as experienced in this, but I would say the media is the message. And you really have to get out and get on the social media and use it right now, particularly during the pandemic. Although there are people hungry and people who don't have jobs and all of these awful situations, we have many people who are not in such difficult situations and they have time. They've been on that rat race doing things and they have time, and all of a sudden they're seeing on TV what's happening with a chokehold or what's happening with something else. So let's use this time to infiltrate the media in positive ways too, and forward our cause. And I need to learn more on how to use the media to do that, because other than my Facebook, not doing it.
I totally think that you have a really great idea there, and you know, hopefully we all can continue to do more social media exchanges and highlight of the great practices and join together, because I think one of the things that I'm excited about this summer, like Sarah said, is, you know, this coalition of people who are interested in supporting the students, and not maybe, but I know that in numbers we can make mountains happen. It's when you're alone that is harder. And thankfully to you, really moving mountains by yourself and then bringing the right collaborators and key stakeholders, you know, we are where we are today. And now it's a matter of joining together.
And using a virtual platform in Zoom,
yes,
helps someone like me living in Maine, who, you know, I'm not going to drive down to a meeting in Boston, but if I could be of help through Zoom, through, you know, through the virtual participation, it makes it very easy also to include people who are older.
That's right.
You know,
that's right. And that
it's
consultation
to share and build new histories together, and develop new conversations and dialogues. I think that you, Pat, joining today and sharing some of your experiences and your story is invaluable to our watchers, the people who are participating right here. You are giving them the gift of history, because a lot of us don't necessarily know it, right? We don't necessarily know it, and it feels like our actions aren't as proactive or productive because we don't have these histories, because we're not aware of these histories. And I'm so grateful to you for spending your time today sharing with us, our participants as well, all of this invaluable information. Thank you.
So for all of you watching, I hope that you take at least 3 action steps that you could take from today's conversation. I know I have, and I'm going to email the director of special ed at the state, the ELL director at the state. They're going to hear from me. And And I gotten a couple ideas of how, you know, we could restart some of these professional network meetings. So thank you,
Very
Pat, for
interested.
the amazing sharing of the history, your recommendations, your expertise, and your time today with us. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for caring.